I think you can go ahead and start.
Okay. Okay, so last week we discussed two early modern movements in Mexico that were shaping really the idea of national identity in that country. We saw the estudiantismo with the 3030 group that was like initiated by Arce, Manuel Maples Arce. And then we saw how this movement, the 3030, really opened up to the Mexican muralism, right? And how they were challenging the Academy of Fine Arts and trying to make changes in the education system in Mexico, and really, you know, creating these workshops and schools for young artists to participate in and get educated. And that was like kind of the foundation for the muralism that became kind of a widespread art movement, but also kind of like a system a didactic system, right, for the masses, to educate the masses post-revolution. And how, you know, you had the three main muralist artists, and from that on, like this style, like the social realism, became kind of monumental in Mexico. And we saw some of these examples, a very extracted image, very small extracted image from one of the panels of the Ministry of Education that was painted by Diego Rivera. And we kind of like discuss how there's always like the same similar figures, right? The soldier, the peasants, and the communist worker, right? And these are kind of metaphors for kind of a unity that it's like the desire, right, of the post-revolutionary government, right, that's trying to get everyone, all these social classes, all these races and ethnicities together to become modern, right, after the revolution. And we discussed also, you know, how the murals are always related to the architecture and to the monumentality of these buildings. There were governmental buildings in Mexico. Today, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the anthropophagic movement, which is a movement that happened in Brazil in the early 20th century. And that was, you know, it's happening kind of parallel to Mexican muralism, but it's like, it has some similarities, as you see. But it has become, in the US, in the study of art history in the US about Latin America, the Mexican muralism and the anthropophagic movement have become kind of part of the canon, right? So that's why we usually, it's kind of like something that you have always to teach and talk about, because they have become so important in that, well, not only in their own countries, but here in the US as well. So as we saw with Mexican muralism and kind of like the context of that, of the emergence of these movements, you have the urbanization of happening fast or faster, right, than it was before in these countries, and especially in the most important cities in these countries. So this is an image of São Paulo. This is downtown area, and São Paulo becomes in the early 20th century this kind of like urban center of the country, really, right? And it's becoming that at this moment in the 1920s, around that moment, because especially they start to produce coffee and have coffee farmlands in the regions, and they then become very like a coffee oligarchy that we mention in that at that time. And you can see this is the municipal theater in São Paulo, and it took I think more than 10 years to get finalized. The building. It's building based, kind of a copy or a replica of the Opera Garnier in Paris. And it is kind of like becomes this iconic building for São Paulo and for the rest of the country, really. And it's built in eclectic architecture. And then you can see all the markers, right, of this rapid industrialization, rapid urbanization, electric lights. The palm trees are very little. They had just been planted. So this is the moment really that, you know, start to see this urbanization happening in this country. And this is also the site of the emergence of the anthropophagic movement, actually. So in 1922, a group of young intellectuals, the kind of like the emerging intellectual elite at the time, decides that they're going to challenge the Academy of Fine Arts. They're going to challenge all conservative types of art that was being taught in Brazil at this time. So they gather together, they get the approval and kind of like also the, you know, some funding from the coffee oligarchies at the time, and they present their, you know, their version of modernity to the audiences during a whole week. So it's called the Week of Modern Art, and it happens in 1922. And let me move on to, so this is a group of like poets, musicians, artists, architects. One of them, I don't have his portrait here, but Villa-Lobos, you probably are familiar with, is part of the group, and he presents his compositions during the Week of Modern Art. And so it's like, it's a big event. It marks really modernity, the beginning of modernism in Brazil. So that moment, 1922. But it's a fiasco in terms of audience. Like the audience hates everything that is being presented. You know, they throw fruits at them and like boo and everything, because they, you know, they are trying to break with the status quo, right? They are trying to challenge those, the very same audience that they are presenting to. So it's not really like, they're not presenting to the right audience, to say the least. So there's a lot of like, you know, backlash in the press, and it's really because they were confronting, right, those oligarchies and those the older generation of artists. But okay, that week happens. It gets, you know, it becomes, you know, after that, it becomes like a groundbreaking event. But at the moment, it has a lot of resistance from the conservative classes, even though they were funding the event. Well, as you know, that happens here across history as well. But after that event, we see that this young group decides to really gather and start to, well, we have to move on. We have to continue pushing our agenda, our new style of art and poetry and literature, music. So they leave for Paris in 1923. And I just want to highlight this person here, who's Tarsila do Amaral. She's a painter. Also, Andrade is a poet. He is the kind of the founder of the anthropophagic movement with Tarsila. And this is Anita Malfatti, who's another painter who's all like receive a lot of like the fire from the press. But they are, you know, they continue, they move on and go to Paris to study. So after, you know, doing research, studying, they become the anthropophagic movement, right? So the Week of Modern Arts, you probably hear about it. It's actually having an anniversary now in 2022. So it is like the foundation if you want to know more about poetry and literature from Brazil. But then for the arts, it's really the anthropophagic movement that kind of stems from that Week of Modern Art. And what is the anthropophagic movement? It becomes then this intellectual movement in which music, visual arts are all interwoven. So they were all these intellectuals were working together, and as I mentioned to you, visiting Europe, but also visiting their own country, going to the rural areas of the country to kind of like create a new style for their art and other manifestations. But they, again, as I mentioned, they sought to defy, right, European modernity, but they want to appropriate certain ideas, right, of the European culture, but they want to return to Brazil's indigenous knowledge. And how do they do that? By using this term anthropophagia, which is the eating of the enemy's flesh. So they start to call themselves the anthropophagic. So they will devour European culture to produce an original Brazilian modernity, right? So again, similarly to what happens with Arce, the Mexican intellectual who was like trying to, he was sending letters to European friends and everything to get this kind of like communication with them. So the Brazilians also were looking at the European culture and looking at these traditions, but they wanted to digest them, right? Kind of like devour and digest them. And they use this as a metaphor for their for the movement. And again, they are looking at the kind of transnational, but also the local conditions, right? The indigenous knowledge, right? Because that's the eating of the enemy's flesh comes from this indigenous knowledge that we have here. So just to give you other images from that moment, this is the poster for the Week of Modern Art and also the cover of the exhibition catalog. And then here you have another image in which they depict themselves protesting, and they are referring to other composers, other generations, like Carlos Gomez. If you know him, it was a classical music composer. So they are referring to other painters of the older generation that they were kind of attacking. So this is like I think this should be Villa-Lobos here, and kind of like playing and agitating things. So especially in the arts, we have Tarsila do Amaral, was this iconic figure really in Latin American art history now, and she goes to Europe to study. As I mentioned to you, she begins to be in touch with Cubism in Europe. She saw like Picasso. She enters in contact with all these other traditions in Paris and in Europe overall. But then when she returns and participates in the Week of Modern Art, she starts to really think, well, I should try to come up with a new style, right? Try to, not that I'm going to erase what I learned in Europe, but I want to look at my culture. I want to look at the regional aspects of my culture. So she says, I'm deeply Brazilian and I'm going to study the taste and the art of our country people. I hope to learn with those who have not been corrupted by the academies. To be a Brazilian artist is not to paint only Brazilian landscapes on farmlands. So she wants to look beyond this style. And I think I showed you an image, a painting that has a similar style of this one from Mexico. And again, this was the style that was being taught at the Academy of Fine Arts, and you could not paint anything else in another style, right? If you were studying at the Academy of Fine Arts, you had to paint like this. You had to follow the colors and the composition and the themes that were being studied at these academies. And I'm not sure if I mentioned, but these academies were usually founded by the colonial ruling, right? So it's kind of like keeping with that tradition of colonialism. in a certain sense. And so Tarsila and others, they want to, they want to change. They want to change to this style. And it's not to say that these are not Brazilian things, right? So this is being depicted. It's kind of like an illustration for a book that was called The Last Tamoio. So this is the last indigenous man from a certain ethnicity in Brazil. And this is a work of literature from that time, from the 1880s. And then you have the painters would then, refer to that history and refer to those works of literature, and they would kind of illustrate these themes, kind of like national themes of that are related to colonial history. So it's not that they are not, related to Brazilian history. It's just that the style is still very much European and academic. So let's see what she starts to do. She starts to, be inspired by colors and tones, and that are related to, things that she sees in farmlands. So her family owned a farm, a big farm. I think it was a coffee farm, actually, in the rural area of São Paulo. And then she starts to be inspired by these colors. She starts to be inspired by shape, like organic shapes. So you can see, how she's like creating these rounded shapes, but still very much, I feel, in the tradition of Cubism, right? With all this, like this area here of the shanty town, it's still very much, a composition that is kind of like similar to kind of a grid here. But then she's breaking with that, with the organic shapes, right, and colors that she's being inspired by, as she sees in these areas. She will also create paintings such as this that are, again, highlighting the industrialization. I'm sorry. So this is the trainway of one of the main trainways in Brazil that she's trying to depict. And you see the electric lights and posts and, mixed kind of like a conflation of that industrialization with the rural as well, and in nature, right? So get juxtaposed in this composition. But then it is this specific painting that marks her career and creates this change in Brazilian art history. And I don't know if I would love to hear like from you in terms of an interpretation of these two, and kind of a comparing of these two images. I think that would be, I would love to hear what you see, right, in these two images, and to see why she was trying, what was she's doing really in this work to challenge this other style, right? What do you think she was achieving here in terms of like, or trying to aim at to challenge this other style? Does anyone would like to try?
Well, I would.
Yes.
I think that the painting, the Rodolfo Amoedo, is an illustration of something external, a text of some sort. It's trying to enhance with very realistic details something that's being described somewhere else externally. Whereas this one, the Tarsila piece, is grabbing themes and colors and ideas and trying to be provocative. It's a provocation almost of and saying, like reproducing the real, something you could see in nature as exact is not as important as trying to provoke thinking about what's real, what's important, what's valuable.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, Yeah, I think that's exactly what she was trying to do. Instead of like, depicting something that is like exactly the way it is, she's trying to provide some type of expression, right? An interpretation about something instead of like, having it kind of as an illustration, as you mentioned, to a period, to a type of history. So it's much more, open to interpretation, I think, right? In terms of like, what do you see there, instead of like having the realistic painting in which, well, this is what you see. You cannot move away from that, right? There's an indigenous man laying down and someone is like helping, it's a friar or some religious figure. And there's no really, maybe you don't know the context, the history behind this painting, but you really cannot move away from the fact that these are two human figures and there's kind of a stress and right. But here you could say, well, I don't know, is that a monster or something? Is there, there's kind of an openness, a little bit, more open to interpretation in that sense. But still, it has some clues, right, in terms of what she's trying to evoke. Would you like, anyone else would like to just describe what you see in this, in the feel, what you feel about it? Yeah, go ahead.
I feel it's sort of surrealistic.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Why?
Dreamlike. Well, and the distortion of the sizes, the use of the cactus back there and the sun, it all strikes me as a dreamlike.
Yes, yes. She was very much inspired by surrealist art as well. So yes, the size of the feet, right? It looks like you're maybe dreaming or having a nightmare. I don't know, something that it's like not, maybe something unconscious, right? And that is like coming up to you, not really the, but it's like, that's exactly what they wanted to do, right? Would anyone else want to say something? Ziggy, you're there.
Hi, Tati.
Ziggy.
Yeah, there's something really compelling. Tarsia's obviously her painting that's pulling the viewer in terms of identifying with this almost bereft, lost, lone figure. There's an intimacy in Rodolfo's there, even though it's a dark theme, the last Tamayo, but this is sort of inviting you into that sense of lostness. There's almost like this touching of the ground, where am I, like on this earth, and the Indian, just the wave washing up. It's where am I on this? And I'm kind of invited into that almost despair, that I feel emotional energy in that Tarsia's painting.
Yeah, thank you, Z. Thank you for coming to the class. Yeah, so I think, all these interpretations are really, coming from this painting, because I feel, first of all, they were trying to assess the type of unconscious and collective unconscious of Brazilians, right? Especially because they wanted to draw from indigenous culture, but they wanted to also digest that culture, right? So they wanted to appropriate it, but digest it for kind of to become modern, right? So it's borrowing from indigenous knowledge, but then how do we become modern, right? How do we grapple with that knowledge, that pre-colonial knowledge that's coming from all this energy from indigenous culture, but then we cannot really go back to it, right? We have to be modern. We have to become modern as Latin Americans. But definitely the surrealism is an important source for Tarsila, and Lois noted, the distortion. So everything looks like kind of like awkward really in terms of like the representation. And you can see, again, the touching of the ground is also important because it's returning to that ground, right? It's trying to, the movement itself, the anthropophagic movement is trying, these artists are returning to the local, to the rural. So the touching, the hand that touches the ground is very also like a symbol of that return to the culture, to the indigenous culture. Anyone else would like to say?
Well, I just wanted to say that in terms of modernism, it is the sort of distorted perspective you can get photographically.
Mm-hmm.
If you,
Yes.
a wide angle lens at the feet would give you that kind of view of the person.
Like tilting a little bit, like instead of like having that, yeah, definitely. And kind of like just displacing the viewer, right? In a sense, the eye of the camera. Let me move on. But with, you know, all the idealisms and that we have in this moment, you know, they were trying to, these young artists were trying to look at something and create something from scratch. But at the same time, they had a kind of like a limited understanding of indigenous culture, right? Their understanding was still coming from colonial imagery, from colonial, you know, knowledge about indigenous peoples. So the anthropophagic movement was using the term anthropophagy, right? Kind of loosely in a way, because, for example, eating flesh, eating human flesh, it's like a simple, the simple act of eating human flesh is cannibalism, right? Anthropophagy is something different, that you have an entire ritual that was organized by indigenous peoples in Brazil that lasted days, in which those who had who were victorious in a battle, they were eating their enemy's flesh to appropriate their qualities, right? So it was not an act of vengeance and you know, a simple act of vengeance. It was a sacred ritual in terms of appropriating those qualities and kind of becoming one with the enemy that was vanquished. And this, but this was not what you know, colonizers knew at the time, right? They were looking at the eating of flesh and just seeing savagery, right? And these were the early colonial depictions of eating, of cannibalism that we have from the 1500s. So the anthropophagists in the early 19th century, they were looking still at this, right? Even though they were trying to romanticize indigenous cultures, the information they had, unfortunately, was still colonial, right? Colonial type of information coming from that. So just to give you a bit of more context about the title of this painting, it's called the Abapuru, and it's a Tupi language, so an indigenous language from one of the indigenous ethnicities in Brazil. And then it's translating man who eats human flesh, right? So Tarsila is looking at this, but you know, there's still a kind of like a romanticization and idealization of indigenous cultures that today we know, well, it's not savagery, right? It's like a whole ritual that was a part of a social system, right? That it was not uncivilized. And I'm gonna read just an excerpt of the Manifesto. So after Tarsila painted Abapuru, the man who eats flesh, her lover at the time was Oswald de Andrade, who was a poet that was participating in the Week of Modern Art that I mentioned. And then Oswald wrote the manifesto, the Anthropophagic Manifesto. So he's usually said to be the leader, the founder of the Anthropophagic Manifesto, but he was actually looking at Tarsila's painting. So they were kind of working together in a sense. So they both should be recognized as the founders of the movement. And also, this is a very short, I put the original, I think the whole manifesto for you in the drive, if you are interested in reading it. So I'll just read this short excerpt. Anthropophagy alone unites us, socially, economically, philosophically. The words one and only law, masked expression of all individualisms, of all collectivisms, of all religions, of all peace treaties. We were never catechized. We lived through a somnambular law. We had Christ born in Bahia or in Belém do Pará. To be or not to be? That is the question. So that's the famous line of the movement, to be or not to be. And then that becomes, for Brazilians, that becomes like a joke even, right? That they say Christ was born in Brazil. This is something that we still say, right? So this becomes a celebration really of indigenous culture and the local cultures of Brazil. And if you read the whole manifesto, you see they are celebrating Brazilian culture, indigenous culture, but they are always attacking someone. They were attacking European culture. They are attacking the US with Coca-Cola. They mentioned that in the manifesto. So there are all these jokes and types of challenging as a true manifesto, right? In terms of asserting themselves as part of the status quo. Let me show some other paintings. And these are other, she continues on this style of, combining surrealism and cubism. And you can see here a Black woman. So again, it's not only indigenous cultures, but African Brazilian cultures, Afro-Brazilian cultures that are being, incorporated in this movement. And I always try to show Picasso as a reference because I think it's really, you can see the dynamism of the lines, like the diagonal lines here and the position of the face. There are, and of course, right now, even though Tarsila is there's important figure in Brazilian history, she's being criticized, right? From the Black movement in Brazil because, well, this woman was actually, I'm sorry, let me go back. This woman was actually someone, her nanny, at that time, and she never even gave a word to that person, like in the painting, right? She was writing about her nanny, writing about that, but not really acknowledging that, perhaps. So in Brazil, that has been kind of like right now, the younger generations are kind of like criticizing her for that, but it's still, she's very much like this person who wanted to put Black people into visibility, right, at this time. So you wouldn't have a Black woman in such a confrontational position in a painting in Brazil, right? They were usually depicted as maids or in that type of style from the Academy of Fine Arts. So this is the first moment in which a Black woman appears in a painting that is like, she's not someone who's facile, right? She's really a figure that is like challenging something, and although, idealized as well. And this is a quote by Mário Pedrosa, who was a critic from the 50s, working in the 50s and 60s, and he's an amazing, really important critic from Brazil. And there's a small book with a gathering of all his writings about art. And he was very close to, the late modern artists that I'll discuss today as well. So he says about this moment, the anthropophagic movement, he says, unlike their super civilized European role models, Brazilian modernists did not need to travel to the exotic latitudes of Africa or Oceania to renew their strength in the poorer and more vitalized sources of certain primitive cultures. Turning inward then into the country with their back to the sea, the intellectual leads of modernism formed the notion of a caboclo. And that word is someone who's mixed. Like the caboclo is like I was mentioned to you in Mexican muralism, who's the mestizo, right? The racial miscegenation, right? The product of racial miscegenation. So at the same time that Mexican muralism was looking at mestiçage in racial miscegenation in their artworks, Brazil was also, you know, trying to reach this idea that everyone was being, you know, in a celebration of cultures and races, kind of an amalgamation of races, and everybody was becoming a mestizo, right? And or a caboclo. And some other paintings by Tarsila from this moment, combining the Abapuru and the Black woman in the same painting, and then, you know, the emphasis on the foliage and the organic images. This, I think it's an orange, as Lois, I think, mentioned. This is very surrealist, if you can, you know, it's also about referring to indigenous myths of the big snake, of, you know, of creation in a sense with the egg as well. It's kind of like the genesis of something. I was looking here at my notes. It's called the Urutu cobra. It's one, a snake that is like referring to indigenous cultures as well. I love this painting. I think this is one of the most beautiful ones from Tarsila, so I always put it here. This one too. So this figure here is also from indigenous myths. It's called the Akuka. So it's kind of like a monster figure that appears in indigenous stories and legends. So you see that departing from the early, you know, style that it was like still very cubist and mixing, you know, the urbanization with the rural, and then she arrives at something very different, right? That it's like going deep and plunging deep into indigenous culture, even though, you know, with all its, you know, with all its present day critiques. I think she was really trying something that was groundbreaking for Brazilian painters at the time, right? They were not, you know, the Academy of Fine Arts would never look at indigenous knowledge, indigenous stories and depict them, right? Mark, would you like to say something about this?
No, I'm just enjoying it.
Okay.
You know, you can't look at those heart-shaped leaves on that tree and not think about looking at trees again.
Yeah, I think that's the goal. Really to change the perception about this artworks. So so I think we can move on. I will love to hear about any ideas you have about Mexican muralism and how these two movements are similar. They are happening at the same time, right? They are Mexican muralism in the 20s, early 20s, and then Tarsila and others creating these movements. And I would love to hear any thoughts about that, or I can just move on to the Constructivist impulse, which is from the 30s on in Latin America.
Well, one question is, in that group picture you showed of the majority were women, which seems to be quite unusual, especially in 1920. So was this generally true of this group? Was
Yes.
Brazil just more tolerant of women getting involved in this kind of thing?
Yeah, that's really, I don't have an exact, precise historical answer to that, but what we discussed is that, yes, they were, important figures. This is an image, I must say, this is not the official image of the group. The official image I removed, which is a room with all men at the Week of Modern Art. And the women are not there in that kind of the official picture of the Week of Modern Art. But they were there, they were participating, they were very active, and you can see that they are in the first, row here. And yeah, at least I don't remember these two, who they are, but these three women, Tarsila, Anita, and this is Pagu, who actually becomes Oswald Andrade lover after Tarsila and Oswald break up. So a little bit of gossiping. And Pagu was also a poet, an intellectual. They were all, very radical women for the moment. And, Anita Malfatti, she was actually, I only spoke about Tarsila, but Anita was the one who received the first fire from the conservatives, because she comes from Germany in the 1920, I think, before the Week of Modern Art, and she shows she has a solo exhibition in São Paulo, and she shows a portrait of a yellow man, with the man has like a yellow skin, and is distorted, is like cut. I don't have it here, but just because I wanted to do a short lecture, but it's like she receives the whole criticism from the conservatives in the beginning, and then other figures such as Oswald and Mário de Andrade, they come to her rescue and say, well, let's start then a movement. Let's all do something that challenges these conservatives, and then that's how the Week of Modern Art starts. So Anita is also an important figure to initiate the movement. And I don't know why Brazilians were allowing, that prominence of women. At this time, they were still very much, they couldn't vote, and the same, problems that we have in the US at that moment, and, but they were allowed to go travel and study in Europe. So that's, I must say also they were, upper class, and that may be something that helps, right, in terms of like having access to money and being able to travel and to move around. So definitely, but yes, and I keep that's my version of history. That's the image that I chose to show. Yeah, so but the official picture, Mark,
and the difference, I think, and I'd like your opinion, in Mexico, the artists were explicitly identifying themselves with the world communist, revolutionary, working class movement, liberation. So it was political liberation as well. Whereas this seems much more like trying to establish a national cultural identity that is distinctive. Not so much, I mean, I don't know, maybe these all people were communists too, but that seems like a much more pronounced feature of the Mexican mural movement and that we saw.
Yes, you're totally right. And so Tarsila, I feel like the beginning of this movement, the Week of Modern Art, well, the revolution in Mexico ends in 1920, and then Tarsila, and they were doing in 22. So I think that it comes, these ideas of Mexican muralism come to Brazil a little bit later. And then Tarsila actually paints a portrait that is like all about the workers that's a different phase that comes after the paintings that I showed you. And then she's, okay, I need to address a more political side. And then she paints, I'm going to show you quickly. I think it's easy to find, but then I have to share my screen. Let me just show it first, find it first. And it's actually, I don't know if you've probably seen it, but it has circulated in this time of internet. Let me share my screen here. Stop sharing and sharing again. Can you see this painting?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's from 33. And then so you can see there's still a little bit of like that interest in, in the working class. But yeah, she realizes that 10 years later, right? And I have to talk about this too. And then she paints that work. But overall, you're completely right. They are not concerned with, creating kind of like this political message that Mexican muralism was totally focused on. But I believe Tarsila was also a communist. She went to jail at this moment in the 30s because she said she was identified with communism at this moment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Would you guys want to have a break now so I can start the next round of?
Yeah, this would be a good spot. Yeah.
Okay. How long would you? 5 minutes? 5. Okay. Okay. See you soon then.
Okay.
Thank you for keeping the lines open, Barry, because I kept losing the signal. We've got an internet problem here just now.
Oh,
okay.
I was in and out for about 15 minutes there, not getting. It seems to become steady again, but I don't know what the problem was.
Yeah. We haven't had problems today. Okay, there we go.
I think it's definitely at this end. Both Elaine and I lost the internet.
Okay. Oh, Mark. Okay. Hello, Mark. We're just we're just in the middle of our 5-minute break here. At least today we didn't overlap with the hearings, although they start right at noon, I think. When we
At noon.
Yeah.
One of the annoying
hearings...
things I'm finding is that a lot of the channels want you to tune into them an hour before it actually starts. They want to talk at you for an hour before you get onto the business of the day, which is annoying if you want to set up a recording. You're recording an hour more than you want.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
I've been thinking about that group of people going to Paris, there was such a conservative looking group, the men with their fedoras. And were they going there to see, you know, Pablo Picasso and Dali, all of whom would never be wearing a fedora. Just
yeah.
Their painting was quite not conservative, but their general appearance was
More conservative.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's a picture I can let me see if I can find it. It's just that I deleted the slide because I had too much information. Let me see if I can show you this image, which is way more conservative, you would think, I guess. Let me show you this. So this is can you see this image? The
Yes.
video, yeah. So this is the official like image that you have of the participants.
Uh,
Yeah,
All
you don't
guys.
see. Yeah, all guys. And then but the actual. And then there's another, let me see if I can find, I don't have it here. Yeah, I have so many different versions of the same presentation that I keep. Yeah, but this is here is Oswald Andrade, who wrote the Manifesto, Mário de Andrade, who's another very like an amazing writer and philosopher. He was one of the theorists really who grounded the whole anthropophagic movement. So it's not really just paintings and it's not really just music. They were really making something together that remain in history. So
do paintings from this Brazilian group appear in U.S. museums?
Not really. Tarsila do Amaral actually had her first retrospective in 2018, 19 at the MoMA, and was the first exhibition in a major US museum. So no, they were not being, they were doing this for Brazil, really. They were not. And overall, that happens with Latin American art, and it's really I'm not sure I mentioned to you, but when I talk to my peers about Tarsila, art historians usually, they still undermine Tarsila. They still think that she was a naive painter, and I mean the style is really a bit childish, right? She's like looking at these very basic colors and not basic colors, but I mean, childish things, really. Playful. There's a playfulness in her work, right? And that it's cause of people undermining her and not really studying her here in the US, unfortunately. But that has changed. Now, with the coming to MoMA and a lot of people, there are always scholars who admire her work. But I mean, if you talk overall, she's not, maybe because she's a woman, because she was painting in that style, But we are changing that. So are you guys ready for the next?
Yes.
Okay.
Sure.
You can still see this, right? Let me just play. Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Always has so many windows. So, okay, moving on, we're still looking at chronologically as at the movements. There are movements, And so we're going to start looking at the constructivist impulse. So it's a departure from everything that is social realism that we were looking in early modern art. I'm going to skip this because these terms will come up. So these are other examples of, social realism in Latin America. So this one you probably recognize is from Diego Rivera. And just because of Barry, you asked the question that if Tarsila was being shown in the US or Diego Rivera was actually, as I mentioned, I think last week, he was painting murals here in the US, in San Francisco, then in New York. So he was more like, he became famous in the US when he was still alive, right? Which is, for artists, as you know, is something that is not always the case. So this is Diego Rivera. This is Portinari, who's also from Brazil, but a very distinct from Tarsila. And I put them side to side. But he is more the guy of the, social realism in Brazil with the political themes. And this is Indigenism. It's part of another art movement that I'm gonna not have time to talk about, but it's prominent in Peru, in Guatemala. So, but it's all under this umbrella of social realism. This one here is Portinari depicting a coffee farm that was mentioned to you in São Paulo, becoming so important as one of the economic activities in this moment. So this is the 20s, right? The 20s, 30s in Latin America. Of course, I'm generalizing, but it's kind of like the main trends. And then what happens next is that geometric abstraction becomes the main idiom, the main language, aesthetic language of Latin America, beginning in the 30s, from the 30s to kind of the 70s. So there are many reasons for that. I'm going to try to unravel some of them to you. And I have here just this quote. I think I'm going to skip it. If you're interested in this reading, it's in the Google Drive. But it's just talking about how Latin America wanted, after the war, really wanted to become this international news center, and geometric abstraction then, especially in the 50s and 60s, really becomes this important language that it's like trying to speak to Europe and the US in terms of, we are international aesthetic center, come here, see, our development, economic development. So what are the three main, trends that we see in late modern art, right? So early modern art, social realism, late modern art, kind of inspiration of constructivism. So in the 30s and 40s in Uruguay, we have Joaquin Torres Garcia, who becomes like the main name of geometric abstraction. Then we have kinetic art from the 40s and 60s that is spread out, Venezuela, Argentina. And then Mark mentioned Soto last week, and we're gonna see a little bit of some of his works. And then in Brazil, in Argentina, concrete and neo-concrete art. So all these terms, they are kind of like variations of the same idea, geometric abstraction, right? They have different theories behind them, different goals, aesthetic goals, but they are all looking at geometric abstraction. So I'll start with Joaquin Torres Garcia from Uruguay. Let me just get my notes right here. So Torres Garcia was born and raised in Uruguay, and he became a mentor figure for many, many Latin American artists later on, especially in Buenos Aires, artists who are interested in geometric abstraction later on. And he spent 30 years in Europe. He lived in Barcelona, and then he lived also in New York. He saw Mondrian. He was in love with Mondrian, and when he returned to Uruguay, he wanted to bring this, bless you, sorry, bring these traditions that he saw for 30 years in Europe to Latin America. But he wanted also to create something new, as we have seen with all this, these artists, they want to make their mark. So he says, well, I'm going to start a school really of art here in Uruguay, because I want to create, for the younger generation. So he says, I have said School of the South, because in fact, our north looks south. For us, there must be not a north, except in opposition to the south. This correction was necessary, and because of it, we know where we are. So, and then this comes along with the image of the continent inverted, right? That he's putting the north, the south as the north. Well, I'm not going to go into the whole idea of maps being also something that come from colonial knowledge. If you look at maps, right, why is the north the north? It really doesn't make any sense. If we think about that, is all you can. There's so many perspectives, right, that we could just turn it around. And that's what he's doing. He's saying, well, we are the north of our culture, right? So we have to look at that. And then he defies that idea of north and south by inverting the map. And obviously some allusions to, colonial times with the caravels here, I don't know what it, I guess, trying to mark some specific areas when the colonizers where the colonizers arrived. So he gives a seminal lecture in which this is an excerpt from this lecture. And again, he was rejecting not only challenging this idea of the North and the South, but he was also rejecting social realism in Latin America. He didn't really want to subscribe to that political type of art. He wanted to advocate for invention. So that's kind of the word that he uses in many of his writings and movement that he comes up with. And he wanted to look at, rational and theoretical properties of compositions. So this is just, to create kind of a key term. The School of the South is the name given to his workshop, where he decides to disseminate the ideas and the principles of universal constructivism, which is the name of the movement that he initiates. And what is then universal constructivism? I'm sorry again. He was not only looking at Mondrian, he was still interested in Mondrian that he had learned from by being in Europe for many years, but he was also looking at Andean pre-Hispanic culture and aesthetics and how they use geometric patterns. Right, so you have here, I'm just putting an example of an Inca tunic from early pre-Columbian times, or maybe in that span of time. And then that's what he is looking at for inspiration. This is the type of art that he starts to create, composition from 1932, which is one of the main initial paintings that he is doing as part of that movement. So he's, as you can see, he's very bidimensional, right? There's, there's a grid that organizes the entire composition, but there's some difference from the tunic. Could you identify some of them? How are these two different?
Well, in the Incan tunic, they're all square format. The pattern is consistent throughout, and in his painting, he has grid which is made up of both rectangle and square, vertical, horizontal. So he's kind of jazzing it up a little bit. And of course, there's more than one image within each of those patterns.
But there is a
Yes.
repeated figure. There are repeated figures in the tunic, and
Yes.
but if you look at the center top, there's a figure that's repeated in the bottom right. And I think that
Is this one? Oh, there are many actually that is being repeated.
yeah. I have to look carefully, but it's there.
With only one arm.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
With only one arm.
Yeah, I don't know what, so the Incan woven tunic, they are usually so much, related to also sacred ideas of geometry. So I must say that I should have, chosen one that I knew more about. But I just wanted a basic comparison between the two, and what you can see is that he's putting like pictograms, right? In terms of like creating maybe a narrative as well here, which is not to say that this is not narrative, right? They have their own, thinking through their own culture, but there's a clear, more figurative narrative that is not at all only abstraction, right? So it's kind of like in between this figurativeness and the abstraction and it's also kind of monochromatic as well. So that's exactly what he's doing. He's trying to extract the idea of the tunic and the pictograms, but he was also creating something that moving beyond that, right? Looking at Mondrian as well.
There's something very interesting in the upper left-hand corner. The cross, yes, where it says Nord at the top, Sud at the top, at the bottom, but it's reversed. Este y Weste is in the so.
Thank too. Maybe
it means that his north is really south.
Yes.
If you want to turn it upside down, it's correct.
Yes. Yeah, messing up definitely with that. Yeah. Yeah. I also have like readings that tell, that analyze all the pictograms, which are fascinating, that I can share with you. And unfortunately, I read it once, but it's so much information that I don't remember the exact meaning of each of the pictograms. But he was very interested in these images of time, like time to reverse time, space. So you have there's a ladder here, the man and woman. I think there's a word maybe. No, I think it's not in this painting. That there's the beginning of a word. So he's taking inspiration from indigenous myths as well. Not only thinking about the picture plane as a grid. This is an actual monument that he created. This is in pink granite, so unfortunately I don't have a better image. And on the ground you have a sun clock here with the inverted north and south as well. And it's very clear to see man at the center, right? The human figure at the center as well.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I love his art. I think it's like so many, references that I wish I could focus on him for maybe next years after I finish my Ph.D.
How big is that?
How big?
Yes.
Let me see if I have it here. Oops, sorry. I'll have to look. But I'll say, well, I'm not gonna guess. Let me try and look for a moment. I don't think I have anything here that says the size. Yeah, let me do a quick search. Yeah. Looking at my notes. Cosmic monument. There's a picture of it, probably taken more recently. Of course, they only give me subscribe today to read the entire. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I probably have to look up but I'll share just what I see here and you can guess.
I love the whole sense of the wall itself, even the geometry of the shape of the wall.
Yeah, let me share another image, a more recent, like a recent image. Unfortunately, you're gonna see it's not very well taken care of. Let me. Can you see this?
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it probably needs to be restored. I don't think it doesn't look very tall at all. But I don't. Yeah. I'll share with Barry the information when I have it. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Sure. Close this. Yeah. So finally, I think Joaquin Torres Garcia, he was still interested in constructivism, right, from Russia in a sense, but then he wanted to do something else. He wanted to create, so this is a drawing from 1938 that is referring to Tatlin's monument that was supposed to be the headquarters of the Communist Party. This is just a model. I don't know if you know more about this work from the 1919. So Joaquin Torres Garcia is referring to that tradition from Russia, but then he's more interested in invention instead of like something that is politically inclined, as in Russia with communism. And yeah, I think you can see here the aesthetics of pre-Columbian art as well that he's looking at. And this is not to say that other, European versions of constructivism were not looking at indigenous culture, right? And you have Joseph Albers who are looking at the pyramids and I think in Mexico in this case, and drawing from that as an inspiration. And a couple of years ago, I went to the Guggenheim. There was an entire exhibition that was looking at Albers and Mexican culture and pyramids and colors that he was interested in. So Study for a Sanctuary. So I have here a little bit more context to talk about other artists from Latin America and what were the aesthetic influences. So these were not coming, they were borrowing from several influences. So the first one we discuss here is the pre-Columbian artifacts, so Andean geometries, pictograms, totemic symbols, right, that they were looking at and kind of being inspired by. Then we have Russian constructivism, in which you have aesthetics that is always associated with Marxism, right? An aesthetic that was created to oppose capitalist society. So it's not art for art's sake, right? Art is political and it's being created, to change the society, to create a new society. And then we have Mondrian as also another inspiration for Latin American artists. And you see even, Brazilian artists in the 60s were still looking at Mondrian and being, in love with him, and using his rational formalism, the laws of the universe, right? Kind of like guiding as part of his idea of geometric abstraction. I hope you don't see my messages coming in. Do you see any texts that are coming in? Okay,
No,
thank you.
no.
It's so distracting and it's coming in. Okay, and then the Bauhaus had an immense, influence in Latin America, and some of these artists were studying and thinking about the Bauhaus specifically to create their artworks. But then, these are all different theories, right? These are all different. They look similar because they follow geometric abstraction, but underneath them, they are thinking about, different ways of organizing art and thinking theoretically about art. So when it comes to Latin America, and then Latin American artists drawing from all these sources, it's hard to really decipher, what is coming from where exactly. But it's just to give you an idea that this was not coming from scratch, and they were all very inclined to study and to look at these movements. And I have here Laszlo Moholy-Nagy as one of the references to Bauhaus. And as you know, art to organize society, right? The Bauhaus was seeking that, the good design that was transformation to society. But then, as you know, it gets corrupted or incorporated into capitalism. And now we all think about good design, right? When we live in our homes and everything. So it's kind of ideal, but it also becomes part of capitalist society. So let's move on to look at one of these, other figures who is working in around the 50s, actually. So Soto was born in Venezuela. Jesus, I say Jesus, Jesus Rafael Soto. And he was born in 1923, Venezuela, and then he studied in Caracas, Venezuela, but also moved to Paris. Again, a common story, right, that we see. Moved to Paris, and then he was associated with Jean Tinguely, who was in Victor Vasarely, who were part of the Kinetic and op art movements. And then he really, exhibits and has solo exhibitions and group exhibitions with these other artists from Paris, and becomes part of Kinetic art movement in Europe. And then what he says, I think he was trying to, again, challenge social realism. And this is very clear here from this quote. At the time, 1950s, politics presented socialism as the only possible future, and in art, socialist realism. However, I was never interested in that, and I was certainly never passionate about Russian communism. I wasn't a believer, and Stalin terrified me. I always defended the artist's independence from political inclinations. So this quote really sets the tone to other artists from Latin America who were thinking like Soto. They thought that social realism, as we see in Mexican Muralism, was indoctrinating, really, was, limiting the ability to people to experience an art, right? And was kind of a very limited version of history. So he was looking for art for art's sake. And so this, what really he starts to create in 1952, one of the early paintings from this moment in his career. So he wanted to look at light, energy, motion, and music and sound. So these are kind of like the organizing principles of his career. And in this one, especially, you have motion as one of his intent. And what do you guys think about the movement in this painting? Do you see movement here? How do you see it happening?
Oh, this is wonderful.
Take your time to look at it.
It's so rhythmic and so alive. So in its monotone, you know, just that not known, you know, it's just all about movement and sound. It's very audible to me. The shape changing in the sticks moving and the dots happening. I mean, it just, I want to dance.
Yeah, serial music, right? In terms of like,
completely.
yeah. So you see here, he keeps the white squares for the entire, for most of the, right, the canvas. Here, of course, not. But then you have this line that is the one that is moving, right? I don't know if you can see this. I'm sorry, I'm trying to. My mouse is like moving around. But you can see the black stroke here and how it's like giving this idea of rotation, right? That is the title of the work, and that the square is really rotating, and there's this repetition, right, and seriality of the shape. But then is that little square, that little stroke really that is marking the idea of movement. And then finally it gets to a moment when you don't have the square anymore and you only have dots or the strokes, right? And so that's how his idea of rotation and movement is it's coming from. The progression, right? Through the repetition and the progression of the repetition, you get to the idea of motion.
So this interesting idea, Tati, maybe you can speak to how we view things like we read, or at least the eye starting at the top left, moving like a text.
Yeah.
And is that, I mean, this whole idea of, you know, flipping it, or where we end up, you know, where the white squares are gone and now we're just in a dot matrix, and then just at the very end, da, 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 da.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the intention. I think I put it here like a quote that in which he says, the work could be cut anywhere, or it could continue indefinitely without me having to paint it, right? So it's really about, this could go, it's just like a proposition that he's making, like a bidimensional proposition that could be, you know, perpetuating through the wall. So I'm not sure if it's like, I would read it as beginning here, but maybe it doesn't have to be that way. We could, you know, start here. I think in this work, I think there's this inclination to read it just because it starts here, at least from top to bottom. You know, there's this whole, but it's really your perspective, your own perspective of where you can begin. And that's going to appear in other works of his and other artists. They don't want you to, they want you to be open to start where you want to start looking at the image, right? Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
The universal piece in all parts of this painting is the rotation. So you can start anywhere and see the rotation, and the blocks, the white blocks, are invisible in some places, but they are implied. And it just feels like even in the white blocks here, if you look carefully, there's dots that are showing the rotation.
Exactly.
And so it's anywhere you want to start, you are rotating.
Yes. Yes, you still have the unit, right? The same unit, the same dimension here, even though you don't see the white color anymore, but it's still there, the grid.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So yes, I think the idea is that you start to break with that, order and hierarchy in the canvas. So another one from him. So he started to use dynamic, making the painting more dynamic with diagonals and curved lines. And thinking about Mondrian. He says non-drawing concepts of repetition and progression. So they would, at the end, they would say, this is not a drawing, this is just progression, this is repetition, right? I'm not making anything that is figurative. And then he starts to think about using kind of like, instead of the canvas, like objects that are coming out of the wall, kind of off the wall. So he creates this by using this acrylic transparent element on top of the black squares, and then tilts it. So you have kind of like this kind of like vibration of light. If you move across, the not painting the object, this is still on a wall, but it's more dynamic. If you're a viewer, right, and moving around it, you see it differently from different sides.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not gonna read this. It's just a definition of kinetic art. And then this one, I think it's very musical for me, at least I feel like it's, if you look at from the other side, yeah, you can see the little strands. So he starts to create these assemblages instead of just having, the bidimensional artwork on the wall. It comes off, right? And you move across it, and then it evolves into this.
It makes part of the.
Go ahead, Mark. Yes. Mark.
It makes a viewer. It makes a viewer part of the experience of the in a very dramatic way, because wherever you position yourself, you see it differently, and if you move slowly through it, it changes before your eyes.
Yes. Yeah, so it's very clear, I'm sorry, I keep changing. It's very clear to see the progression, right, in terms of his own career and his own, here he says, I want to draw in space. And from that idea of drawing in space, you get a whole environment really, in which you're like being overwhelmed by this abstraction, right? And he says, later when I started working with metal rods over a woven background, I started wondering what would happen if I could put myself inside that vibration.
Exactly. Yeah, that's it. That's what it feels like when you see these pieces, or you move through them in a way.
Yeah, I'm going to show you a quick video so others who haven't had the experience, let me stop sharing. It's a short video here. Okay, let's, so many windows, let me close this one. Yes, here. And I hope the audio is going to work this time. Let me see.
Yeah.
Can you hear? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Is it too loud? Let me.
No, perfect.
Okay. It's just 3 minutes, so we can have an idea.
Jesus Rafael Soto is one of the most remarkable artists of the 20th century. Born in Venezuela, the second half of his career took place in France, mainly in Paris. And he was one of an important generation who explored ideas of space, movement, kinetic art, essentially a formalist, thinking about color and shape and the realization of form, using what he knew about human perception in order to realize spectacular works of art like the one behind me here. It was commissioned in 2004, and many historians will remember that we had a similar but much smaller work on loan from a private collection out on Bissonnette. And it was magical to see the interaction of the public with that work, and that gave birth to this much larger piece. Unfortunately, the artist died the following year, but his studio and his assistants continued the engineering necessary to make this work. It's 24,000 PVC strands, all of them hand painted with yellow in order to realize that perfect ellipse in the center. 8 tons of steel above or below the ceiling, and then of course all the lighting. It was all last summer that 7 people worked to thread each of those strands into the superstructure, the armature, and then it took another 4 weeks this spring in order to mount it here in Cullinan Hall. But it's spectacular. It's been, without question, our most popular work of art and enjoyed by our visiting public. I don't think any two experiences are alike. People bring so much of their own history and memory and experiences. One child came through and said car wash. Other people think of science fiction and space travel. The beauty of the work is that the imagination is set free, and you can experience it either as capturing space, because it is the realization of space, and we become so aware of that cube within that extraordinary fan-shaped volume that Mies van der Rohe created. The perception of that ellipse, which is constantly changing. To me, I like it most from outside and from this balcony, so I can watch individuals inside enjoying it and then watching the color dance as the yellow orb reflects light. But wading through it is a lot of fun too, and taking a selfie inside and then uploading it to your Pinterest or Instagram account and enjoying the printout that we provide here from the printer is a great souvenir to have from the museum. We'll take it down this autumn, and then we'll put it back up from time to time, every 2 or 3 years, as time allows and the space allows. But already a number of my colleagues at other museums have asked to borrow it. So I have a feeling this work has legs, and we'll be seeing it probably around the world in the years to come.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so this was one of the last, I guess, commissions from museum, I think, for Soto. But you've been to one of them, right, Mark? And
Yeah.
would you like to share a little bit?
It was at the Guggenheim Museum in New York, which, if you know that building, it's a kind of inverted spiral, and the center is very high, and so it was very easy to walk at the ground level through something very similar to what we just saw. And what happens is that the way the light penetrates when you move those strands, it changes the patterns in front of your eyes all the time. And every movement you make changes what you visually experience. It was really absolutely memorable and thrilling.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Yeah, I feel like he is very successful. He was very successful in his idea, right? And being overwhelmed by this vibration and this sense of like light and movement. So, Lois, would you like to say something? Okay, so let's continue on to see other artists who were also inspired by constructivist art. So now my guys, like the ones that I'm more kind of like, I have studied these two for many years, and I always get like so excited to talk about them, but I always forget a lot of things to say about them, because they're very special artists for my, for my education in my study. So just to give more context, right, in terms of geometric abstraction, from the 40s to the 60s, reintroduced this idea of rationality and structure and revisited the possibility of utopia, right? That accompanying like the infrastructural modernization and these ventures that projected the desire of Latin America to gain prominence on the global stage, economically, politically, and aesthetically. So it was like these aesthetics that these artists were coming up with in the 40s and 60s were actually used as well by theorists, by the government, really to speak to Latin America as a center for modern art, modern architecture, and modernity itself. In Brazil specifically, I mentioned Russian constructivism, I mentioned Mondrian, all these sources coming in, but architecture, then modern architecture, is one of the main, definitely main sources for artists to draw from and create geometric abstraction. Oscar Niemeyer is one of the most famous architects from Brazilian history. He designed and planned Brasilia, which is now the capital of Brazil. And he and other, I forgot his name, Lúcio Costa, he planned this city from scratch, like a modern city from scratch in the 50s. And I think the year of the final set stone put on in Brasilia was 1960, so April 1960. But imagine starting a whole city from scratch and a whole modern city from scratch. That's what Oscar Niemeyer and Lúcio Costa were doing. And this was the city was commissioned by the president Juscelino Kubitschek, and it was really, to become a symbol of modernization and modernity in Brazil. And it really became so, right? You can see a picture here of Oscar Niemeyer in front of, let me show again, in front of the, oops, keep going to the wrong side. In front of the construction of Brasilia, and this is the palace, the main palace, where the presidential palace of Brasilia being built. And this is how Brasilia looks like from the top, from an aerial view. I'm sorry. So Brasilia was designed to look like an airplane. I don't know if you know a little bit about the conception of the city. So it is organized in a monumental axis. So here and here. And this is actually the north and this is the south, or, well, not based on Joaquin Torres Garcia, just north and south. So this is, the image is just to show you how it looks like an airplane. So Lúcio Costa and Niemeyer, they designed these super blocks areas, right, where you see the buildings. And then across this monumental axis, you have the important governmental buildings of the city. And it's also defined and organized by sectors. So there is an hotel sector, a banking sector, an embassy sector. And here is the kind of like the central area where all the power, right, of Brazil is located in the political power. And as you can see from, well, this is just an image to show you the exact orientation as north and south of the city. And I'm not gonna go into all the different areas, but this is how it looks like from one of the views of the monumental axis. So you can see the super blocks here with the buildings, the modern architecture buildings. This is the cathedral, and these are the main buildings of where the politicians are. So obviously having something like this in your country and so ambitious project as Brasilia is, influence a whole generation, not only of architects, but also of artists. And I went to architecture school in Brazil. It was, I'm not gonna reveal my age, but it was in around the early 2000s. And I was still learning to design buildings based on Oscar Niemeyer style. And it was kind of like everybody had to design modern buildings such as Oscar Niemeyer. So you had to learn that to then do your own thing if you wanted to do something else. But it becomes like a national language really for architecture and for art as well. But obviously it is idealized. So even in Brasilia, which was designed from scratch and well thought and well planned, what we have in Brazil is the slums, right? The flip side of modernity. These spaces, immense spaces of exclusion that exist in many cities in Brazil, and in Brasilia it's the same as other cities. Even though Oscar Niemeyer planned everything, this is the area that he planned. But if you look at these arrows, they are pointing to the suburbs where the slums are. So what happens is that early on, even after Brasilia was built in the 60s, what happens is that the people who came to build the city didn't have a place to live. So I'm laughing, but it's really, it's not, it's an irony, a terrible irony that they didn't plan where would these people live, right? They were moving from other areas of the country, the Amazon, the northeastern areas, because Brasilia is in the center of the country. So they were coming from other states, and they would not have the money to go back to their states. So they would have to live in Brasilia, right? But they didn't have a place. They didn't have these beautiful blocks of modern architecture for them to live. So they started informal, urban areas for them to live. So that's still the case today. There's still this type of construction around Brasilia. So just to say that in Latin America, you have that type of the ideal and the utopia of modernization, but then you have, the reality of exclusion of groups and social other groups of people who are not participating in the same ideals of modernity, right? But in any case, the style, right? The style that is built in Brasilia, the modern style with its straight lines, minimalistic, white buildings, it gets, propagated to the artists. It gets borrowed by the artists, and there is real industrialization. There is real progress coming in Brazil and economic power building in. And in São Paulo now in the 50s, we have the first São Paulo biennial of art. So remember that São Paulo was the site for early modern movement, right? The Anthropophagic Movement in the 50s. Then it still continues to be that site, that important symbolic space for art to live. And then we have the first biennial in 51. And the artists going to visiting the Biennial of Art, they get to be in touch with this type of art. Max Bill, who was one of the founders of the Ulm school in Germany. And this is similar, coming a little bit similar to the Bauhaus school in thinking about good design and universal design that is understandable and easy to grasp to anyone, anywhere, right, in terms of its universality. And seeing that type of architecture, seeing that type of art in the biennial, we have the emergence of the new concrete art by Brazilians, which is a movement that starts in the 60s, so 10 years. It has other versions of it early on in the 50s, but in the 60s that they really start to have a body of work that is kind of groundbreaking. And like Soto, and Soto was parallel to this, was happening, doing work parallel to at the same time that the neo-concrete artists were also active. But I think Soto gets to the environments that he's creating in the late 60s, while the Brazilians start a little bit earlier, but they're all reaching something similar, which is the participant is important. The participation of the viewer is more important than just, looking at the image, looking at the artwork. So let's see some examples of that. I'm going to skip this because we're almost at the end. So again, a woman artist becomes prominent in this movement, the neo-concrete art movement, Ligia Clark. This is one of the early works by her. Also, thinking about dynamism and movement, in a sense, a little bit different than Soto. Thinking about breaking with the hierarchy of shapes and the organization of the painting. So you have different surfaces being juxtaposed or painted in relation to each other in terms of the color. Again, trying to break with the canvas, right? Trying to, this is really 4 different surfaces that are being put side by side and organized. And this is actually, the lines are not drawn, they are physical space in between the planes. So she's thinking about, well, how can I grasp real space, not, undrawings, like Soto was saying. I don't want to draw anything. I want real space in my art. And like Soto, 1959, you see, trying to move off the wall with these surfaces and planes. So she creates the cocoons. They are just folding of surfaces coming off the wall. And then she reaches an idea that is like, she calls these objects that are not painting anymore. They're coming from the tradition of painting, but she creates objects that are articulated and you can fold them. And she calls them creatures or beasts, bichos. And she creates them in different sizes and shapes. And I'm gonna skip this just to show you a quick video of how you articulate them.
Tão barato mesmo. Parece patinho.
Thank you.
Deve estrelar. Tantas coisas, né? Tantos bichos.
They're saying a lot of creatures, different creatures.
Uma coisa espacial mesmo, né? Ganham.
So I think you get the idea, right? That you're.
Lugar, né? Tem lugar. Tem lugar.
There's no beginning or end, right, to this. There's no. It's really something that you're doing. You're learning by doing it, right? And it's not anymore about the artist, but the artist is proposing and giving that object to you. And you as the viewer is gonna finish that object, right? By handling it, by changing the composition. So, and it's like, but it's still coming from painting, it's still coming from that tradition of geometric abstraction, but it's going a step beyond that. I'll stop here because there are more, in terms of like participation that I can talk about, but I know we're almost at the end, and I want to hear from you a few thoughts and ideas about this, how it works.
Well, I'm a little surprised that that last type of thing isn't more commonly seen. I mean, it's ingenious, so you can have a piece of art that's different every day. Are these available? Can you buy these kinds of things?
Yes.
That's a great question. So right now, you can, if you have, like, they're very expensive, like the original ones. But it's a whole, a polemic around these artworks, and specifically about these artists, because the state, they don't want to pop, like, not that they don't want to have access to the work, but they keep it very elitist, and they don't want to, they charge a lot for just to take a picture of this artwork. So it's like, it's a problem of like family conflict, and Lygia Clark's sons are fighting with each other for a long time, and so it's becoming harder and harder to show her work, and in consequence to sell her work as well. And yeah, but yes, the idea, her original idea is that this was something that anyone could do, right? Anyone could assemble one and have one. And, she was giving that, she called them proposals for the viewer that could be easily, achieved by the viewer itself. And next week I'll talk more about these works, and because there are a lot of other things that she created after that, and I want to share that with you. But yeah, the short answer is yes and no. Anyone else would like to share anything or ask any questions? Or
I have a question. I just wondered if Niemeyer buildings were anywhere else outside of Brasilia.
Oh yes, well, all over Brazil for sure. From the top of my head, I don't remember exactly the countries where he built. Probably the US.
Yeah. I've seen some in Rio de Janeiro.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, all across Brazil, all across. So as I mentioned to you, we got like, it it's a doctrine. Like modern architecture was a doctrine. It is still, like, if you study architecture in Brazil, and Oscar Niemeyer was very active until the end of his life, and he was still making, architecture.
Yeah, wasn't he over 100 when he died?
Yes, I think he was over 100. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I never met him, but I have a picture of a friend with him, and so for architects and architecture students, he was a major mentor, and like, yeah, like, yeah.
Did he design other things than buildings?
That's a good question. I probably say yes. They probably design furniture for sure. Yeah, and artworks. His sketches are amazing and usually part of exhibitions worldwide. He was definitely, beyond an architect. He was an artist for sure.
What I love about the pieces that you can shape and change is that it enables the viewer to be the artist.
Right. Participant.
Yes.
Yeah, you're a participant. You're in it, and it's really remarkable.
Yes. Yeah, and next week I'm gonna show you more, like goes way crazier than that.
Good.
Yeah, I really love like to teach Lydia Clark. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to the end, but I'll make sure to show you some of her later works that get like amazingly crazy. And it's all about participation. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent.
Anyone else would like to say anything? Or sorry, Mike.